Hey guys, Bill Campbell again. We're going to talk about analysis and valuation of fixed income, and today we're going to be talking about measurement of interest rate risk. You're going to love it, so let's get going here. All right, broadly we have two approaches to measuring interest rate risk. One is we can use what we call the full valuation approach. We can go through our entire bond portfolio, take each security, and revalue it based on whatever kind of interest rate change we want. We can have interest rates change in a parallel shift of the yield curve, or we can have a steepening or a flattening, or we can have one particular interest rate go up and another one go down. We can go wild. Do whatever we want. We have to have good valuation models to do this, especially if we have bonds with embedded options. So if we have callable bonds or puttable bonds or mortgage-backed securities that have prepayment options. This can take a lot of work on the part of the analyst to come up with accurate models, but assuming that we have the accurate models and assuming that we have sufficient computing power and we have enough time to wait around and let it do it, we can get extremely good values on our portfolio. If we don't quite have the time, or we don't have the skill, or we don't have the computing power, or we simply need a quick and dirty approach to approximately how much is our portfolio going to change in value, then we can go the duration convexity approach there on the bottom. This gives us a reasonably good approximation in limited scenarios. Notice that the duration convexity approach applies only when we have parallel shifts in the yield curve. So all yields move up by the same amount, or all yields move down by the same amount. But it's a quick approach, it's an easy approach, and in many circumstances it provides us all the information that we need. Okay, here's a typical curve that shows us the price of a bond versus yield to maturity. This bond has no options. It doesn't have any call option, prepayment option, put option, conversion option, exchange option, no options at all. And so this is a typical shape for a price yield curve. It's convex toward the origin, so it's curving upward. Notice that as yields drop from 8% to 7% to 6%, not only does the price of the bond increase, but it increases at an increasing rate. So the lower the yield drops, the faster the price of the bond goes up. Conversely, as the yield to maturity goes up from 7% to 8% to 9% to 10%, the price of the bond drops, but it's dropping at a slower and slower rate as the yield goes up. This means that when we calculate the sensitivity of the bond's price to a change in yield, it's going to depend where we are on the curve. It's going to be more sensitive at lower yields, less sensitive at higher yields. Now take a look at this curve. This curve shows the price yield for a callable bond. The solid curve up on top, by comparison, is the option-free bond. That's the same as the previous curve we were discussing. But now the dotted line there shows what happens when we have a call option. Now remember, a call option is owned by the issuer of the bond, and it gives them the right to buy back the bond at a particular price. Usually they have to pay a slight premium. But let's say they have the option of buying back a bond at a price of $102. So for a $1,000 bond, they could buy it back whenever they wanted to at a price of $1,020. What effect is that going to have on the market price of the bond? Well, the market price of the bond's never going to go over $1,020 because no rational investor is going to spend $1,030 on a bond today and then risk tomorrow having the company come and pay them only $1,020 for it. So that call price is going to put a cap, an upper limit on the market price of the bond. So we notice on that dashed line that once we get below a particular yield, the yield is y prime. Once we get below that particular yield, then the price starts to flatten out and it's capped by that call price. Notice how that changes the shape of the curve. The curve used to be convex upward all the way, but now once we get below a yield of y prime, it starts bending downward. So we get it convex downward. We refer to that as negative convexity. Notice that the price change is much smaller for the callable bond down there at the low yields than it is for the option-free bond. Notice too that the difference between the prices, the difference between the price of the option-free bond and the price of the callable bond, that difference in price represents the value of the call option. Suppose instead of a callable bond, we have a puttable bond. Now we have an option that is owned by the bondholder, by the lender, by the person who owns that bond. And when the call option can be exercised, they can go back to the issuer and they can demand that the issuer buy the bond back at a particular price. Now usually that price is below par. Usually it's at a discount. So maybe the bond is puttable, but it's puttable at $980. So a $1,000 bond, they could sell it back to the company, but they would get only $980 for the bond. That's going to set a lower limit on the price of the bond on the open market. Because if you owned a bond and you knew that you could go back to the company and sell it for $980, then you would not go out on the open market and sell it for $970. That put price is going to put a lower limit on the market price of the bond. What we see in the dashed line on that puttable bond, therefore, is that above a particular yield, the y prime on our yield to maturity axis, our horizontal axis, above that, the put option starts coming into play and the price of the bond doesn't fall as much as it does for the option-free bond, which is shown with the solid line. Once again, as with the callable bond, the difference between the price of the puttable bond and the price of the option-free bond is the value of the put option. The calculation that we're going to do to measure the sensitivity of the bond's price to a change in yield is what we call duration. Now here we have a calculation for effective duration. In a little bit I'm going to tell you about a couple of other kinds of duration, but for the moment we'll talk about effective duration. Effective duration is going to calculate the approximate percent change in price of the bond for a 1% change in yield to maturity. So remember that. It's the percent change in the bond price for a 1% change in yield to maturity. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a yield to maturity today and a price today. So V0 is our current price and it's at a particular yield to maturity. We're going to make a change in that yield to maturity. We're going to increase it by an amount called delta y, and we're going to decrease it by an amount called delta y. It's very common when people are doing this calculation to have delta y be 50 basis points. That's a very common change in interest rates. So that the total change from down 50 basis points to up 50 basis points, that total change is 100 basis points, 1%. We want to know what's the percentage change in price for a 1% change in yield. So we change the yield, we drop the yield, notice we drop the yield by an amount delta y, and that gives us a new price on the bond. And of course, when yields drop, we expect the price of the bond to go up, so this should be higher than the current price. Then we do another calculation where we increase the yield by delta y. Box that off. And that gives us a new price, V plus. The little subscript plus says that's the value when yields went up. The subscript minus on the other is the value when yields went down. So the subscripts tell you yields going down, yields going up. We take the difference in those prices, we divide by today's price, by V0, that gives us a percentage change, and then we divide by the total difference in yield. So notice, we're dividing by delta Y, and we're also dividing by 2. Why? Because the total change in yield from V minus to V plus, the total change in yield is 2 times delta Y. We went from minus delta Y to plus delta Y. So this gives us the percentage change in price. We call this effective duration. You have to be able to do this calculation. You will see this calculation on your exam. No question about it. You're going to do duration calculations on your exam. Make sure you can do this one and you can do it quickly. Let me give you an example here. We have a 15-year option-free bond, so no call option, no put option, no prepayment option, no options at all. Annual 8% coupon, pays an 8% coupon once a year. It trades at par, so current value is 100% of par. What is the effective duration? And notice, as I told you on the previous slide, very common, we're going to go up 50 basis points, we're going to go down 50 basis points. Very common delta Y when we're doing effective duration calculations. When the price goes, or when the yield goes up 50 basis points, the price drops from 100 down to 95,848. When the interest rate yield to maturity goes down 50 basis points, the price goes up from 100 up to 104,414. Now all we have to do is take all these numbers and put them into our formula. So here's the calculation. We have V minus, the price when yields dropped, of 104,414. We have V plus, the price when yields increased, of 95,848. We divide by the current price, that gives us a percentage change. We also divide by 2 times the change in yield. Now notice that when you divide by the change in yield, make sure that you write that as a decimal. This is 50 basis points, or 0.005. Don't write that as 0.5, thinking 0.5%. Remember that you have to change it to a decimal. You do this calculation and you get the effective duration, 8.57. What does that mean? That means that for a 1% change in yield, the price will change by approximately 8.57%. I'll show you on the next slide how we interpret this. How do we use this? Our 8% 15-year par bond has a duration of 8.57. So the change in price is going to be calculated using this formula. Negative duration times delta Y. Do me a favor, circle that negative sign. Remember that when yields go up, prices go down. So you have to have the negative sign in there. So if you have a positive change in yield, you're going to have a negative percentage change in price. So if yield to maturity increases 0.3%, the bond is going to change by approximately negative 8.57 times 3%, or negative 2.57%. So we would expect the value of the bond to drop by about 2.57%. That's how you use duration. Once again, you will have to do a calculation like this on your exam. Make sure you include that negative sign. One of the wrong answers will probably have the wrong sign because they know that people will forget to put that negative sign in there. Let somebody else make that mistake. You're the one who's going to get this one right. Okay, I promised you that I was going to tell you about different kinds of duration. So here we go. 3 kinds of duration. The first is Macaulay duration. This was the original idea of duration. And I want to explain this one a little bit because understanding Macaulay duration, first of all, it's fairly easy to understand. And second of all, once you understand it, the conclusions that you draw about Macaulay carry over to the other kinds of duration. Mr. Macaulay was a Canadian, but as you can tell from his name, his ancestry is probably Scottish. And I'm allowed to joke about the Scottish because my name's Campbell, so I'm Scottish, so I'm allowed to joke about Scotsmen. And as you probably know, Scotsmen have a reputation for being very concerned about money, very frugal. And so Mr. Macaulay was concerned when he invested in a bond, he wanted to know how long was it going to take until he got his money back. That's a very, very typical Scottish attitude. How long until I get my money back? So what he did was he calculated how long until he got each payment on his money. So let's say he invested in a 10-year bond that was paying coupons every 6 months. So he knew he was going to get some of his money in 6 months, some in a year, some in 18 months, some in 2 years, and so on. And he wanted to come up with a weighted average of the amount of time until he got his money. And so for the weights, what he did was he took the present value of each cash flow. So for the 6-month period, he took the present value of the coupon he's going to get in 6 months. Multiply that by 6 months. He took the present value of the coupon he was going to get in a year and used that as the weight to multiply by a year, and so on, until he got down to 10 years. Let's say he had a 10-year bond, and he took the coupon plus the principal that he's going to get in 10 years, the present value of that, times 10 years, and he multiplied all that out. But then because he wanted weights for these, he had to divide by the sum of all of those weights. So the sum of all of the present values. Of course, you know the sum of all the present values of those cash flows. That's just the price of the bond today. So he got this weighted average amount of time until he gets his money. The shorter that is, the sooner he gets his money, the happier Mr. Macaulay was. Once you understand this calculation, it's easy to see how changing different characteristics of this bond will change this calculation. And he called this calculation duration, and because it's a measure of time, the units on duration is years. Now, the easiest duration to calculate is the duration of a zero coupon bond. If you have a zero coupon bond that pays off in 5 years, well, you get 100% of your money in 5 years. So you get 100% of your present value in 5 years. So the Macaulay duration of a 5-year zero coupon bond is 5 years. That one's pretty easy. The Macaulay duration of a 10-year zero coupon bond would be 10 years. Of a 20-year bond would be 20 years. So you can see that as the time to maturity increases, the Macaulay duration increases. Now let's talk about bonds that pay coupons. Suppose that we have a bond that it's not a zero coupon bond. Say it pays a coupon of 6%. And it pays it semi-annually. So every 6 months we get 3%, 3%, 3%. And then 10 years from now we finally get the principal payment. Well, now we're getting some of our money early. With the zero, we had to wait 10 years to get all of our money. Now we're getting some of our money early, a little bit in 6 months, a little bit in a year, and so on. So the weighted average time till we get our money is shorter. So as we get a coupon, that shortens the duration. If we get a higher coupon, we get higher payments early, a higher percent of our money comes in earlier, that shortens the duration even more. So now we know 2 things about duration. The longer the maturity, the longer the duration. The higher the coupon, the shorter the duration. I'll give you one more variable, yield to maturity. What happens to the duration when yield to maturity changes? Well, if you think about it, the yield to maturity, we're going to be using that as the discount rate to get our present values. I'll take 2 examples. Let's compare a 1% yield to maturity and a 10% yield to maturity. When we discount our cash flows at 1%, well, the near-term cash flows, those aren't going to be affected very much. The cash flow that we get 6 months from now, a year from now, whether we discount it at 1% or 10%, it's not going to make a big difference in the weights that we get on those near-term cash flows. But the cash flow that we get 10 years from now, its present value is going to be a lot smaller when we discount at 10% than when we discount at 1%. So the farther out the cash flow is, the much bigger effect we have from a high discount rate. Put another way, as the yield to maturity increases, we have much smaller weights on the long-term payments, much higher weights on the short-term payments, so it tends to shorten the duration. And again, this is easy to see with Macaulay. So now we know three things about Macaulay duration. The longer the maturity, the longer the duration. The higher the coupon, the shorter the duration. And the higher the yield to maturity, the shorter the duration. And once you can see those for Macaulay, it makes it easy because for the other kinds of duration we talk about, modified and effective duration, those things are always true as well. Now, modified duration, after Macaulay came up with his idea of doing this weighted average time till he gets his money, some of the finance types looked at it and said, hey, you know, if you take that calculation Macaulay just did and you divide it by 1 plus the yield to maturity, what you come up with mathematically is an expression for the percent price change in the bond for a 1% change in yield. So Macaulay did all the hard work. All the finance people had to do was slightly modify that, take Macaulay duration and divide by 1 plus yield to maturity, and now they have a measure of price sensitivity. Because they modified Macaulay's duration a little bit to do that, we refer to that as modified duration. So modified duration gives us the price sensitivity. If the modified duration is 4, and by the way, the units on modified duration are also years, just like Macaulay. If the modified duration is 4 years, then if yields go up 1%, we expect about a 4% decline in the price. If yields go down 0.5%, we expect about a 2% increase in the price. That's modified duration. Both modified duration and Macaulay duration assume that the cash flows are not going to change. Well, you know that there are some bonds where the cash flows do change. If you have embedded options, then the cash flows might change. Somebody, if interest rates change enough, they might exercise a call option or exercise a put option, and therefore the cash flows would change. Modified duration and Macaulay duration can't take that into account. We use something called effective duration. Effective duration allows that the cash flows might change, and so it's useful when we're trying to determine the price sensitivity for bonds that have embedded options. Modified duration won't work, Macaulay duration won't work, effective duration does. Oh, and by the way, the units on effective duration are also years, just like modified, just like Macaulay duration. However, in your CFA Institute readings, you will notice that they usually give modified duration and effective duration just as a number. They usually don't mention years. I just want you to know the proper units for all three kinds of duration is years. Now, more about effective duration. As I said earlier, Macaulay duration and modified duration assume the cash flows won't change. Effective duration allows that the cash flows will change. What could cause the cash flows to change? Well, if you have a bond with a call option, remember that when interest rates start dropping, it makes it more attractive for the issuer to call that bond. They don't, if you have a bond with a 6% coupon and yields are dropping down to 2 or 3%, it may make sense for them to call that bond, stop paying 6% coupons, issue new bonds at 2 or 3%, and save themselves a whole bunch of interest expense. So when yields drop and you have a callable bond, it's likely it will get paid off early. The cash flows change. You're not going to wait 10 years to get your principal. You may get your principal back in 5 years. If you have a puttable bond and yields go up, then you may want to exercise that put option, and that would cause the cash flows to change. You get your principal back earlier. If you have bonds with a prepayment option, people sell their houses, people refinance their houses, the cash flows will change from those that were originally promised. In all of those cases, whenever you have embedded options, you need to look at effective duration instead of modified duration to get the price sensitivity, because you need to take into account the fact that the cash flows might change. Now, CFA Institute lists 3 ways that you might interpret the duration number. The first interpretation, the present value weighted average of the number of years until the coupon and principal cash flows are to be received, that's just Macaulay. That's exactly what Macaulay did in his calculation. Present value weighted average time till he gets his money back. That's a perfectly valid interpretation of Macaulay duration. It may not be the most intuitive. It's certainly not going to tell you anything about price sensitivity, but that is the interpretation appropriate for Macaulay, because that's how the calculation was done. The second one, do me a favor, put a check mark by that second one. That second one is interesting because this is exactly what CFA Institute says. It says you could interpret duration as the slope of the price yield curve, and then to make it more complicated, they throw some calculus at you. You guys don't want calculus, but that's what they do. They say it's the first derivative of the price yield function with respect to yield. Well, certainly the slope of the price yield curve is the first derivative of the price yield function with respect to yield. And every one of you who loves calculus will be really happy with that interpretation. Those of you who hate calculus or don't know calculus are going to look at that and say, that doesn't do me any good at all. I have no idea what that means. Well, CFA Institute tells you that this is not a good interpretation, and it turns out they're right, but not for the reason that they thought. The reason that this is not a good interpretation is that it's wrong. The slope of the price yield curve would tell you the approximate dollar price change in your bond. But duration doesn't tell you the dollar price change. It tells you the percentage price change. So really what they should have done, I want you to write one last phrase down here. Write down divided by today's price. If you took the slope of the price yield curve and you divided it by today's price, that would be the approximate percentage price change, and that would be a valid interpretation. But to try to think of it as a slope, try to think of it as a first derivative, that's not going to help most of you. I wouldn't do it that way. Do me a favor, put a box around that last one. The best interpretation of duration is this one right here, the approximate percentage price change for a 1% change in yield to maturity. That's a good interpretation. It lets you know what's important. Is we want to know if our yields change, what effect is that going to have on the price of our bond or the price of our portfolio? Now, one of the nice characteristics about duration is that the duration of a portfolio of bonds is just the weighted average of the individual durations of the individual bonds in that portfolio. Underline this phrase for me. It says value weighted. Make sure you underline value weighted. And in fact, I want you to add a word in front of that. So over here, write in the word market. It's market value weighted. So you don't use the par value for the bonds, you use the market value for the bonds. And I will guarantee you, if you have a question like this on the exam, they will give you par value for all of your bonds. They will give you market value for all of your bonds. And when you compute this weighted average, one of the wrong answers CFA Institute will give you is using the par, the face value, not the market value. Do me a favor. Let somebody else make that mistake. You use this formula, the weighted average duration of all the bonds in the portfolio, and you remember that it is market value weighted. Use the market value weights and you'll get it correct. Now in practice, this may not tell you the actual price change of your entire portfolio, because remember, duration assumes a parallel shift in the yield curve. Every yield to maturity increases by 50 basis points or decreases by 20 basis points. And in reality, the yield curve may shift something other than parallel. But for a short-term approximation, this is pretty good. Okay, notice here that when we use the duration approximation to try to get a price change on our portfolio, we're treating this price yield curve as if it's a straight line. If we have a very small change in yield, that straight line approximation isn't too bad. We won't be off by too much. But if we have big changes in yield, we'll have big changes in price, and the curvature of the curve is going to mean that our straight line approximation is not particularly good. So if yields drop from 9% down to 8%, our price change, notice, is going to be much larger than our straight line approximation suggests. The price is going to go up higher. And if yields increase from 9% to 10%, our price drop is going to be smaller than that straight line suggests. So somehow we have to make an adjustment to this straight line approximation. The actual price change, if we drop from 9 to 8, the actual price is going to go up to $1,000, whereas our straight line approximation would suggest it only went up to $993.53. The actual price change, if yield to maturity went up to 10%, is $828.41. Our straight line approximation says that it would change to $822.47. So we want to make some sort of an adjustment for the curvature of that curve, and that adjustment is what we call convexity. You can see the price differences here. We need to adjust those, and the convexity adjustment is what's going to take care of that. So recall, we have our 8% 15-year par bond, duration of 8.57. For a 50 basis point change in yield, the approximation that we get from duration is 8.57 years times 0.05, or 4.285%. The actual increase when yields drop is 4.47%. So notice, we have approximated it at 4.28. The actual value is 4.47. So we have underestimated the increase. The actual decrease is negative 4.15. We would have estimated 4.28. So we have overestimated the price decrease. This is always true for bonds with no embedded options. Duration always underestimates price increases for a decrease in yield, always overestimates the price decrease for an increase in yield. We're going to make an adjustment that we call convexity. So in addition to the duration calculation that we did, negative duration times delta y, we're going to add another term. Put a box around this. We're also going to add in this convexity term. Convexity times the delta y squared. Just as with duration, notice down here, remember that you have to write the delta y as a decimal. So if it's 50 basis points, if it's a 0.5%, you have to write that as 0.005. If they give us a convexity of 52.4, then we take that 52.4 times our delta y squared times 0.005 squared. That gives us an adjustment. We are going to add this to our duration approximation of 0.00131 or 0.131%. Notice this is a positive number. We add this when yields go down, we add this when yields go up. If you remember, our curve was always above our straight line, so the convexity is going to increase this and get a better approximation to that curve. Here's our calculation now where we've added convexity. For a yield decrease of 0.5%, when we do the convexity, duration and convexity approximation, we get 4.416. When we use duration only, it was 4.285. The actual is 4.457. So notice, 4.416 is a much better approximation to the actual than 4.28 was. Similarly, for a decrease, when we add our convexity adjustment, we get negative 4.154, which is very close to negative 4.195, much closer than using only duration. So the convexity improved both of these estimates. Once again, on the exam, you will have to do a duration and convexity calculation. Make sure that you remember you add convexity times the square of delta y. You add it whether the duration, whether the yield to maturity increases or decreases. Okay, just like duration, we have modified duration, therefore we have modified convexity, which assumes that we have no changes in cash flows. We have effective convexity, just like we have effective duration, that allows that the cash flows might change. So if we have bonds with embedded options, we're going to use effective duration, and we're also going to use effective convexity. The differences between the two are virtually identical to the differences between modified duration and effective duration. If you have a bond with no embedded options, the calculations are the same. Effective convexity, same as modified convexity. If you have a bond with embedded options, call option, put option, prepayment option, you have to use effective convexity. All right, another calculation for you. The price value of a basis point. This is a long phrase that simply says if the yield to maturity changes 1 basis point, what's the price change, the dollar change in the value of my portfolio? Notice we've been using duration to calculate a percentage change, but now we're going to use it to calculate a dollar change. Here's your calculation. It's very straightforward. You take duration times portfolio value times 0.0001. The 0.0001, that is our 1 basis point, our 0.01%. So we take duration times 1 basis point times the portfolio value. That gives us the dollar change in our portfolio. So we have a bond portfolio has a duration of 5.6 years, a value of $900,000. So we take 5.6 times 1 basis point times $900,000, $504. So if yields change by 1 basis point, if they go up by 1 basis point, we expect to lose $500 in the value of our portfolio. If they go down 1 basis point, we expect to gain $500 in the value of our portfolio. Now, if you're concerned about interest rate risk, not only do you have to be concerned with how much the value of your portfolio will change when yields change, but you also have to be concerned with how much the yields in fact change. And this is now, this brings us to the idea of yield volatility. A bond with a lower duration might still have a greater price sensitivity because interest rates in that bond's realm might be more volatile. Let's say for some reason, we think that short-term interest rates are going to be extremely volatile, long-term interest rates not so much. So short-term interest rates might change, 1, 2, 300 basis points. Long-term interest rates are only going to change 10 or 15 basis points. Then even if our short-term bond has a much lower duration, the increased volatility in interest rates at the short end of the yield curve could give us more price risk in our portfolio. So be sure that you take into account the yield volatility. Value at risk. This is a concept you're going to see in other areas of the curriculum. You're going to see it at this level, at level 2 and at level 3. This considers both duration and yield volatility. It's a calculation of how much can we lose in dollars over a period of time depending on what our duration is and what the interest rate volatility is. So value at risk combines the two. Okay, let's do a problem. Effective duration. If yield to maturity increases by 0.5%, a 5% par bond will decrease in price to 95.5. So it's a par bond. It's a $1,000 bond, so it's priced at 100. It's going to drop to 95.5. So it's going to lose 4.5% of its value. And if yield to maturity decreases by 0.5%, the price will increase to 105.3. What is the effective duration? Well, all you have to do is put these numbers into the calculation. The correct calculation, the correct answer is 9.8, and here's how you do it. You take the price when yields drop, 105.3, minus the price when yields increase, 95.5, divided by today's price, divided by 2, and divided by our change in yield. It's a straightforward calculation, 9.8 years, that's the effective duration. Now we're going to use duration and convexity. We have a bond with a modified duration of 7.8 years, a convexity of 140. If its yield to maturity increases by 80 basis points, the approximate change in price, just put the numbers into your formula. Very straightforward. You should be able to do this calculation in 30 to 40 seconds. The approximate price change is going to be 5.34%. We get this by taking our modified duration times the change in yield and adding the convexity times the square of the change in yield. Okay. Remember to write the change in yield as a decimal, 0.0080 for 80 basis points. Add those up, negative 5.344%. There you go. Simple calculations. You should be able to do these very quickly. Save yourself some time for the really hard stuff on some of the other problems. Well, that's it for duration and convexity. We'll catch you on a later session.